Richard the Lionheart is arguably one of the most famous medieval warriors ever to live, and while his adventures in the Crusades certainly helped to make his reputation, it was another conflict that really established him as a legendary warrior. Hi everyone, I'm here to bring you the history of the Plantagenets, the warrior kings and queens who made England, as you may or may not know, depending on whether you've seen my previous videos. There are four main periods in the history of England: before the Tudors, the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans, the Plantagenets, and the Tudors. It is likely that this series will eventually end with Henry Tudor and the Wars of the Roses, because let us face it, Henry Tudor is one of my favorite but today we're going to talk about the Plantagenets, the family that ruled England from 1154 to 1296. If you'd like to learn more about the history of England after the Anglo-Saxons but before the Tudors, then make sure to stay tuned for future episodes where I'll be covering everything from the Norman conquest to Richard III. Unlike the Normans, who were mostly of French origin, the Plantagenets were Anglo-Saxons by birth. Their name actually comes from Geoffrey of Anjou, whose nickname was Plantagenet after the elder tree at the source of the River Main, that he used to meet his wife. Geoffrey's son, Henry II, inherited his father's Duchy of Anjou, along with two other duchies, Aquitaine and Maine, as well as the English throne. This gave the Plantagenets control of much of western France, which they kept throughout their reign in England. So when we think of the Plantagenets, it is important to remember that they ruled over a sort of trans-canal empire, stretched from the English Channel to the English Channel. Henry II was the first true Plantagenet monarch of England, and he began his reign by curbing the power of the English nobility, which had become too strong during the reigns of his predecessors. He also clashed with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered in 1170 by knights of the royal court after Henry had declared that he wished Becket were dead. Henry's sons rebelled against him during his later years, and upon his death, his youngest son, John Lackland, took the throne. King John was unpopular in England, and he lost much of Normandy to King Philip II of France. Following a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, which limited his power and established the principle that everyone, even the king, was subject to the law. Magna Carta is still an important part of English legal history, and its principles are echoed in the United States Declaration of Independence. John Lackland's brother, Henry III, succeeded him and enjoyed a relatively peaceful reign during which he was able to regain some of the territory lost to the French. Upon his death, his son Edward I took the throne and began the conquest of Wales, subjugating the Welsh lords and incorporating their lands into the Kingdom of England. He also successfully campaigned in Scotland to secure the border with that country. In 1272, Edward established a new order of knights called the Garter, which became the highest order of knighthood in England. Edward's son, Albert, Prince of Wales, died unexpectedly in 1284, and his widow was only allowed to marry the man who was responsible for his death, after she gave birth to a baby boy, presumably so that the succession would be secure. That child became Edward II, and his mother, Queen Margaret of France, served as regent during his minority. She was forced to flee to France in 1290, after a group of English barons deposed her and placed Edward under the control of a group of guardians. Though Edward eventually returned to England, his mother remained very influential until her death in 1299. The English monarchy had long been involved in the affairs of France, especially as it pertained to the Angevin Empire, but it wasn't until Edward I's grandson, Edward III, came to power that England went to war with France in earnest. Edward claimed the French throne after the death of Charles II in 1325, though his claim was weak at best. There was a balding epidemic in the 14th century, possibly due to rampant syphilis, and Edward III was no exception to this trend. Edward III had a son out of wedlock with a woman named Rosamond Clifford, who died in 1291. After this, he married Queen Isabella of France, the widow of his deceased cousin, the aforementioned Charles II, though Isabella bore him 3 children, including the future Edward V. She had an affair with one of her husband's counsellors, Roger Mortimer, and together they plotted to depose Edward and replace him with Isabella's son, also named Edward. Edward III managed to discover the plot, however, and he imprisoned both Isabella and Mortimer in the Tower of London. After Edward's death in 1377, his grandson, Richard II, took the throne, though he was only 10 years old at the time. Richard's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, acted as regent during Richard's minority, but he wasted the royal revenues and incurred the enmity of the wealthy by raising taxes. When Richard came of age, he deposed his uncle and assumed full powers as king. Though Richard was only on the throne for 2 years, he made significant changes to the government and the economy of England. He re-established the Court of King's Bench to administer justice, and he restored the currency of the realm. Unfortunately, Richard was deposed in 1399 by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry V. The 100 Years' War with France continued through the reign of Henry V, who achieved military victories at the battles of Agincourt and Crécy. However, after his death, his infant son, Henry VI, was placed under the control of Henry's widow, Catherine of Valois, and a group of regents, one of whom was Henry V's uncle, the disgraced Richard II. Within a few months of Henry V's death, Richard seized the throne in a coup d'etat and restored Henry VI to full power. Henry VI went on to have a fairly peaceful reign, though it was marked by a resurgence of the practice of primogeniture, whereby the eldest son, in this case Henry's eldest son, Prince Edward, automatically became heir to the throne. Previously, the king had the right to name whomever he wished as his successor, and often his choice fell on a younger son. This practice had been codified in the law in 1285, but it was ignored when Edward I bypassed his eldest son and named his second son, presumably because the eldest son had committed regicide. Now, however, the crown was rightfully his, and Henry's younger son could do nothing to prevent it. Richard II was executed in 1400, ostensibly for plotting to overthrow the throne, though he was just 21 years old. Richard III, Henry VI's younger brother, lived a life of poverty and obscurity after he was stripped of his title of Duke of York. He married a woman named Cecily Neville and had 2 sons with her, one of whom was born with a severe physical deformity. Richard blamed his wife for giving birth to a monster, and he beat her severely after the birth. Cecily left Richard soon after, and he never saw his son again. In 1455, the first battle of the Wars of the Roses took place between Richard, Duke of York, and Queen Margaret of Anjou, who was acting as regent for the incapacitated Henry VI. The Yorkist army was victorious, but Richard was killed in battle and his young son, Edward, fled to Ireland. Margaret eventually took back control of the throne from Richard's heir, the new Duke of York, and Henry VI was restored to health. But Henry suffered another incapacitating mental breakdown in 1458, and Edward landed in England with a small army and marched on London. By 1460, Edward was proclaimed king in defiance of Henry, and this dual monarchy led to further civil war. The situation was complicated by the fact that both sides had claims based on a combination of primogeniture and the king's right of royal selection. Both Edwards were fighting for the throne, as were Richard, Duke of York, and his son, Richard, Duke of Clarence, and Henry's half-brother, Jasper, Tudor, Earl of Pembroke. Edward of York was ultimately victorious and became Edward IV, ushering in a new era of kingship known as the House of York, and thus ending the Plantagenet dynasty. So, what should we talk about next? Will we cover the Wars of the Roses? What about Elizabeth Woodville, the Princes in the Tower, or Perkin Warbeck? Let me know what you want to see in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.